The storm came long before the rain. Far beyond the crowded cities, hidden between dark mountains and thick forests, there was a small African village called Kadala. The people there lived simple lives. They farmed during the day, gathered around fires at night, and feared the deep forest that surrounded them. That evening, something felt wrong. The air was heavy and cold. Birds flew low across the sky as if trying to escape. Even the goats cried nervously inside their wooden pens. Above the village, dark clouds rolled across the mountains like giant black waves. The sky became grey before sunset had even arrived. Old men stood outside their homes, staring upward with worried faces. "This storm is not normal," one whispered. Another shook his head slowly. "I have not seen clouds like these in 30 years. Women hurried to bring clothes inside while children ran home in fear as thunder rumbled across the hills. Near the edge of the village stood a small mud house with a leaking roof. Inside that house sat Nia. She was heavily pregnant, tired, and emotionally broken. One hand rested on her swollen stomach while the other wiped tears from her face. Her mother had died earlier that year, and since then, life had become colder inside this house. Her husband, Kofi, barely spoke to her anymore. The gentle man she once loved now stayed silent whenever his family insulted her. And tonight, the insults were worse than ever. "You brought darkness into this home." Kofi's mother shouted as thunder shook the walls. "Since you came here, nothing but problems have followed us." Nia lowered her eyes, trying not to cry. "I did nothing wrong," she whispered weakly. But the old woman stepped closer, her face filled with anger. "Even the storm came because of your bad spirit." Another loud crack of thunder exploded outside. Rain began hitting the roof hard enough to make the house tremble. Nia looked toward Kofi, hoping, just once, that he would defend her. But he said nothing. He stood near the doorway with his arms crossed, avoiding her eyes. That silence hurt more than the insults. Nia felt something break deep inside her chest. Her lips trembled. Tears filled her eyes again. Without another word, she slowly grabbed her shawl and walked toward the door. "Where are you going?" Kofi finally asked. Nia paused for only a second. "To breathe," she said softly. Then she stepped outside into the storm. Cold wind slapped against her face immediately. Rain soaked her clothes within seconds, but she kept walking. The village behind her slowly disappeared under the heavy rain. Mud covered the narrow paths between the trees. Nia wrapped her arms around herself as thunder roared above her head. Her heart felt heavier than the storm clouds. She remembered her mother's voice. "When pain becomes too heavy, my daughter, never let it destroy your heart." But tonight, Nia felt completely alone. The rain became stronger. Water rushed down the hills toward the nearby river. Villagers shouted in the distance as panic spread through Kadala. "The river is rising. Get inside." But Nia kept walking without thinking. Tears mixed with rain on her face. Then, suddenly, a sharp pain twisted through her stomach. Nia froze. Her breathing stopped for a moment. Another pain struck harder this time, forcing her to grab a tree branch beside the muddy path. Fear rushed through her body. "No," she whispered. Thunder exploded across the sky. Nia looked around and realized something terrifying. She had walked too far into the forest. And now, the storm had trapped her there. Nia clutched the rough tree branch with shaking hands as another wave of pain ripped through her body. Rain poured down endlessly, soaking her hair and clothes until they clung heavily to her skin. The storm had become wild and violent, almost alive. Lightning flashed across the sky. For one terrifying second, the forest lit up around her. Twisted trees stretched like giant claws. Water rushed through the muddy ground. Broken branches flew through the air as powerful winds screamed between the mountains. Then darkness swallowed everything again. Nia's breathing became uneven. "Oh God," she whispered weakly. Fear tightened around her chest. She turned around, trying to find the path back to the village, but every direction looked the same now. Thick rain covered the trails. Floodwater washed away footprints. The forest had become a maze of darkness. Another loud crack of thunder exploded above her. Nia screamed softly and covered her ears. She had never felt so alone in her life. Her swollen stomach tightened painfully again. This contraction lasted longer than the first one. Nia bent forward, holding her belly tightly. The baby was coming. And deep inside her heart, a terrible thought began to grow. She might give birth here. Alone. Tears mixed with rain on her face as panic filled her mind. No, no, please, she cried. She tried to keep walking, forcing her weak legs through the thick mud. Sharp rocks cut against her bare feet, but she barely noticed anymore. All around her, the forest roared like an angry spirit. A tree suddenly cracked in the distance. Boom! Nia gasped as it crashed heavily into the ground somewhere nearby. Birds burst from the trees, crying wildly into the storm. Then came another sound. Long, haunting animal cries echoed through the darkness. Nia froze completely. Her heart pounded so hard it hurt. The wind howled through the trees so fiercely it almost sounded like human voices whispering around her. For a moment, fear nearly broke her spirit. But then, a memory returned. She saw her mother sitting beside a fire years ago, gently braiding her hair while rain tapped softly outside their old house. "Listen to me, Nia," her mother had once said. "Life will test you. Some storms will try to destroy you." Young Nia had looked up nervously. "What if I become too weak?" Her mother smiled softly and touched her cheek. "Suffering does not show weakness, my daughter. It reveals the strength hidden inside you." The memory hit Nia deeply. Fresh tears filled her eyes. "I miss you, Mama," she whispered into the storm. Another contraction suddenly tore through her body harder than before. Nia cried out loudly and dropped to her knees in the mud. Pain spread through her stomach and lower back like fire. She trembled violently. The baby was coming faster now. Fear became reality. No midwife. No family. No husband. Nobody was coming to help her. For several moments, Nia stayed frozen in the rain, breathing heavily while thunder shook the mountains. Then lightning flashed again. And through the trees, she saw something. Far ahead, hidden beneath giant ancient trees, stood a small wooden hut. Nia's eyes widened with desperate hope. Using the last of her strength, she forced herself back onto her feet and stumbled toward it. Branches scratched her arms as she pushed through thick bushes. Mud pulled at her legs with every step. The hut looked old and forgotten. Part of the roof had collapsed. The wooden walls leaned dangerously to one side. Vines crawled across the doorway. But it was shelter. Nia rushed inside just as heavy wind tore through the forest behind her. The inside smelled of dust, wet wood, and age. Lightning flashed through holes in the roof, revealing old hunting tools hanging from the walls. A broken chair sat in one corner. Torn blankets lay scattered across the floor. Someone had once lived here, but not for a very long time. Rain dripped steadily from the damaged roof. Nia winced painfully as another contraction hit her. She grabbed the wall for support and slowly lowered herself into the driest corner she could find. Her hands shook as she pulled old cloth and broken blankets together, trying to prepare a small place for the baby. The storm outside grew even louder. Wind slammed against the hut walls. Then suddenly, crunch. Nia froze. Her breathing stopped. She heard footsteps outside. Slow, heavy, moving through the wet leaves. Fear rushed through her body instantly. She stared toward the dark doorway while lightning flashed outside again. A shadow moved near the entrance. Nia grabbed an old rusted tool beside her, holding it tightly with trembling hands. The footsteps came closer. Another shadow appeared. Then a soft whimper broke through the storm. Nia blinked in confusion. Slowly, a thin stray dog stepped into the hut. Its fur was soaked from the rain, and its body trembled with fear. The animal looked at Nia with wide, frightened eyes before curling itself quietly near the doorway. Nia stared at it for a moment. Then, for the first time that night, she let out a weak, exhausted breath. The dog was alone too. And as thunder roared above the forest, Nia realized the storm was far from over. The storm attacked the forest without mercy. Rain hammered against the old hunter's hut while powerful wind shook the weak wooden walls. Thunder exploded above the mountains again and again, making the ground tremble beneath Nia's body. Inside the tiny hut, Nia cried out in pain. Another contraction tore through her like a knife. She grabbed the dirty blanket beneath her and screamed into the darkness. But nobody heard her. The storm swallowed every sound. Her breathing became fast and broken. Sweat mixed with rainwater on her face as pain spread through her entire body. The stray dog near the doorway lifted its head nervously, watching her with quiet eyes. Nia pressed both hands against her stomach. "Please," she whispered weakly. Please wait a little longer. But the baby would not wait. Another wave of pain hit harder than before. Nia screamed again, her voice shaking with fear and exhaustion. For a moment, her vision blurred. And suddenly, a memory appeared in her mind. Bright sunlight, music, laughter. Her wedding day. Nia saw herself wearing a beautiful white dress decorated with tiny beads. Villagers danced around her while drums echoed through the warm afternoon air. Kofi had smiled at her that day with gentle eyes full of love. "I will always protect you," he had promised while holding her hands tightly. Young Nia had believed every word. The memory stabbed painfully into her heart. Because now, during the worst moment of her life, he was nowhere beside her. Another contraction ripped through her body violently, dragging her back into the freezing hut. Nia cried out and curled forward in pain. The roof creaked loudly above her. Rainwater leaked through broken holes and splashed onto the floor beside her legs. Outside, floodwater rushed through the forest stronger than before. The sound grew closer every minute. The storm was swallowing everything. Nia's hands trembled as she reached for her soaked clothing. With shaking fingers, she tore pieces of fabric from the bottom of her dress. She remembered watching older women help mothers during childbirth in the village years ago. Clean cloth, warm water, helping hands. But here, she had nothing. No fire, no light, no family, only darkness and pain. Nia tried to stay strong, but exhaustion was crushing her slowly. Blood stained the torn fabric beneath her. Her body felt weaker after every contraction. At one point, she leaned her head against the wooden wall and closed her eyes. "I cannot do this," she whispered through tears. The dog slowly moved closer and curled beside her trembling legs. Its wet fur brushed gently against her ankle. That small touch somehow stopped her from completely giving up. Nia looked down at the frightened animal. "You're alone too," she whispered softly. Thunder exploded overhead again. Then another memory came. This time, it was her mother. The old woman stood beside a cooking fire years earlier, smiling warmly while placing both hands on Nia's stomach after learning about the pregnancy. One day, her mother had said softly, "Your child will know how strong her mother truly is." Nia remembered laughing shyly. "What if I become afraid?" Her mother kissed her forehead gently. "Every mother becomes afraid," she had replied. "Real courage means loving your child more than your fear." The memory broke something open inside Nia. Fresh tears rolled down her face. She looked down at her stomach and placed a shaking hand over it. "My baby," she whispered painfully. "You must survive." Another violent contraction hit. Nia screamed louder than before. Pain shot through her lower body so fiercely that she thought she might faint. The hut walls rattled from the storm outside. Wind forced rain through cracks in the wood. Lightning flashed through the broken roof, covering the room in ghostly white light for a single second before darkness returned again. Hours seemed to pass inside that nightmare. Nia drifted between pain and exhaustion. Sometimes she cried. Sometimes she prayed. Sometimes she simply stared blankly into the darkness, too weak even to move. Several times, she thought death was coming. Her breathing became shallow. Her arms felt numb. Her body shook uncontrollably from cold and blood loss. "I'm scared," she whispered to nobody. The dog remained beside her the entire time. Silent, faithful, as if the frightened animal understood her suffering. Outside, floodwater crashed against rocks and trees. The river had overflowed deep into the forest now. Then, suddenly, a powerful pain tore through Nia's body harder than anything before. She screamed until her throat burned. Instinct took over. Her body pushed with desperate force while tears streamed down her face. The pain became unbearable. Nia grabbed the old blanket beneath her and cried out toward the storm. "Please, God, save my child." Thunder answered her prayer. Again she pushed. Again. And again. Her entire body trembled violently. Then, a tiny cry pierced through the darkness. Nia froze. The sound was small, weak, but alive. For one unbelievable moment, even the storm itself seemed distant. Nia stared downward with shaking eyes. A baby girl. Her baby girl. The newborn cried loudly while rain hammered the roof above them. Nia let out a broken sob and quickly pulled the child against her chest. "Oh, thank God," she cried. Tears poured from her eyes uncontrollably. Relief, pain, shock, love. Every emotion crashed over her at once. The baby's tiny body felt warm against her skin. Nia wrapped the torn fabric carefully around the child and held her tightly while thunder shook the forest again. "You survived," she whispered through tears. "My little girl, you survived." The newborn slowly quieted beneath her mother's trembling arms. For the first time that terrible night, Nia felt a small light inside the darkness. A reason to keep fighting. But then, crack! A loud snapping sound exploded above them. Nia looked up instantly. One of the large wooden beams in the roof split apart under the storm. Rain poured harder through the widening hole. The hut groaned dangerously. Another crack echoed through the walls. Fear rushed back into Nia's chest. The shelter was collapsing. And the storm outside was still raging. The old hunter's hut groaned loudly as the storm attacked it from every side. Crack! Another piece of wood snapped above Nia's head. She tightened her arms around her newborn baby instantly. Fear rushed through her exhausted body. Rain poured through the broken roof harder now, soaking the floor beneath her. Cold wind entered through the cracks in the walls, making the tiny baby cry weakly against her chest. Nia looked up with trembling eyes. The roof was collapsing. If she stayed there, both of them would die. Her entire body screamed in pain after childbirth. Blood stained the torn blankets beneath her, and every breath felt heavy. She could barely keep her eyes open. But then the baby let out another soft cry. That tiny sound awakened something powerful inside her. A mother's instinct. Nia quickly searched the hut with desperate eyes. In one corner, beneath an old broken chair, she found a dry piece of cloth protected from the rain. With shaking hands, she grabbed it and carefully wrapped it around the baby girl. "There," she whispered weakly. "I won't let the cold take you." The newborn trembled softly in her arms. Another loud crack exploded overhead. Part of the roof suddenly crashed onto the floor nearby, sending wood and mud flying across the hut. The stray dog barked in fear and jumped backward. Nia gasped. There was no more time. Using every bit of strength left inside her, she slowly forced herself onto her feet. Pain shot through her legs instantly. She nearly collapsed again. But she held the baby tightly against her chest and leaned against the wall for balance. "You must live," she whispered to the child. "Even if I cannot, you must live." Thunder roared outside as Nia stepped toward the doorway. The storm hit her immediately like a wall. Cold rain slapped her face. Wind pulled violently at her soaked clothes. The forest looked darker and more dangerous than ever before. But behind her, the hut groaned one final time. Nia knew death waited inside. So she stepped into the storm. Mud swallowed her feet with every step. Floodwater rushed through the forest paths, almost reaching her knees in some places. She held the baby beneath her shawl, protecting the tiny face from rain as best she could. Lightning flashed across the sky. For 1 second, the forest appeared bright as day. Fallen trees blocked the paths. Water rushed between rocks like wild rivers. The mountains themselves seemed alive with rage. Then darkness returned again. Nia struggled forward slowly. Every step felt impossible. Her body had become dangerously weak after childbirth. Blood loss and exhaustion drained the little strength she had left. Still, she kept moving. Because now she was no longer fighting only for herself. Somewhere far away, wolves, or perhaps wild dogs, began howling into the night. The sound froze her blood. The baby stirred softly against her chest. Nia looked around nervously. The forest suddenly felt full of hidden eyes watching from the darkness. "Hurry," she whispered to herself. Wind screamed through the trees again. Suddenly the ground beneath her shifted. Mud from the hillside began sliding downward with the rainwater. Nia gasped. Before she could move away, her foot slipped violently. She fell hard into the mud. But even as she crashed to the ground, she twisted her body protectively, holding the baby tightly above the impact. Pain exploded through her arms and back. The newborn cried loudly. Nia lay there for a moment, half buried in cold mud, breathing heavily while rain poured over her body. She wanted to give up. She truly wanted to close her eyes and rest forever. "I can't," she whispered weakly. But then, a soft voice entered her mind. "Nia." Her eyes slowly opened. For one strange moment, through the rain and darkness, she thought she saw her mother standing beneath the trees. Warm. Calm. Smiling gently. "Get up, my daughter," the vision seemed to say. Tears filled Nia's eyes instantly. "Mama," she cried softly. The vision lifted one hand, pointing ahead through the storm. "You are stronger than this pain." Thunder flashed again, and the figure disappeared. Nia blinked in confusion. Was it real? Or was her exhausted mind breaking apart? She did not know anymore. But somehow, hearing her mother's voice gave her strength again. Slowly, painfully, Nia pushed herself back onto her knees. The baby had stopped crying now, resting quietly against her chest. Nia kissed the child's forehead gently. Then she stood again. One step. Then another. The storm continued without mercy. Hours seemed to pass inside that endless darkness. Sometimes Nia thought she heard her mother singing old lullabies from childhood. Soft songs that once comforted her during storms long ago. The memories kept her moving. Barely. Her legs trembled violently now. Her vision blurred again and again. Still, she walked. Then finally, somewhere far ahead between the trees, she saw something small. A light. Nia stopped breathing for a moment. Far in the distance, barely visible through the rain, a faint lantern glowed softly in the darkness. Hope rushed through her tired heart. Someone was there. And for the first time that terrible night, Nia realized they might survive until morning. The lantern light flickered weakly through the rain like a tiny star lost inside the darkness. Nia stared at it with tired, half-open eyes. Hope. It was the first real hope she had felt all night. She tightened the cloth around her newborn baby and forced her shaking legs to move again. One slow step after another. Rain still poured heavily from the sky, but the storm had begun losing some of its anger. Thunder sounded farther away now, rumbling beyond the mountains instead of directly above her head. Still, the forest remained dangerous. Mud pulled at Nia's feet. Cold wind cut through her soaked clothes. Every breath burned inside her chest. But the light ahead kept glowing. "Please," she whispered weakly. "Just a little farther." The baby stirred softly against her body. Nia looked down at her daughter's tiny face. "You're so strong," she whispered with tears in her eyes. "Stronger than me." At last, through the trees, a small farmhouse appeared. It stood alone near the edge of the forest, surrounded by wet grass and broken fences. Smoke rose faintly from a crooked chimney while the lantern swayed gently beside the wooden door. Nia tried to call for help, but no sound came from her dry throat. Her vision blurred badly now. She reached the gate, then collapsed into the mud. The baby remained safely protected beneath her arms even as Nia's body hit the ground. Inside the farmhouse, an elderly woman slowly lifted her head at the sound. Mama Sade had lived alone for many years. Her face carried deep wrinkles from age and hardship, but her eyes still held warmth and wisdom. When she heard the weak cry of the newborn outside, fear crossed her face. She grabbed the lantern quickly and opened the door. Rain blew inside immediately. Mama Sade gasped in shock. There, lying in the mud beneath the storm, was a young woman barely conscious with a newborn baby pressed tightly against her chest. "Oh, merciful God," she whispered. Without hesitation, the old woman rushed forward. "You child, can you hear me?" Nia's eyes opened slightly. "Please, save her," she whispered weakly before losing consciousness completely. Mama Sade quickly lifted the baby first, wrapping the tiny child inside a shawl. Then, with surprising strength for her age, she dragged Nia inside the farmhouse away from the storm. The warm air inside felt like another world. Fire crackled softly inside a stone fireplace. Dry herbs hung from the ceiling. The smell of soup and burning wood filled the small home. Outside, the storm still raged. But inside, there was warmth. Safety. Life. Mama Sade carefully placed the baby near the fire and checked her breathing. The newborn cried softly but strongly. Then the old woman turned to Nia. Her clothes were soaked with rain and blood. Her skin looked pale from exhaustion. Mama Sade worked quickly. She dried the baby first, wrapping her gently in warm cloth. Then she cleaned Nia's wounds as best she could while boiling water over the fire. Hours passed quietly. Near dawn, Nia slowly opened her eyes. For a moment, she looked confused. The storm sounds had become distant now. Soft firelight danced across the wooden walls. Then she heard the baby crying nearby. Instantly panic filled her face. My baby. She is safe, Mama Shade said gently from beside the fire. Nia turned quickly and saw her daughter sleeping peacefully inside warm blankets. Tears filled her eyes immediately. She survived, Nia whispered. Mama Shade nodded softly. And so did you. Nia began crying silently. The old woman sat beside her quietly for a moment before speaking again. No woman should face such a night alone. Those simple words broke the pain Nia had been holding inside for months. Everything poured out. The loneliness. The insults. The silence from her husband. The loss of her mother. I kept waiting for him to protect me, Nia whispered through tears. But every time his family hurt me, he said nothing. Mama Shade listened carefully. Nia lowered her eyes toward the fire. I don't even know if he truly loves me anymore. The room became quiet except for the crackling flames. Then Mama Shade sighed deeply. Pain changes people, she said softly. Sometimes it hardens the heart. Sometimes it opens the eyes. Nia looked at her. The old woman stared into the fire for a long moment before continuing. Many years ago, I lost my son during a terrible sickness. Nia's face softened with sadness. I prayed for God to take my pain away, Mama Shade whispered. Instead, he taught me how to live with it. Tears glistened in the old woman's eyes. Suffering can destroy a person, or transform them into someone stronger. Nia listened silently while holding her baby close. For the first time in a very long time, she felt something unfamiliar. Peace. Meanwhile, back in Kadala village, the storm clouds finally began to clear. Morning light slowly touched the mountains. Kofi stepped outside his home with tired eyes. Nia, he called weakly. No answer came. He checked the nearby homes. Then the village paths. Fear slowly crept into his chest. By midday, panic had fully taken hold. She never came back, one villager asked. Kofi's face turned pale. The memory of Nia walking into the storm returned painfully to his mind. Guilt hit him like a knife. Without wasting another moment, the villagers gathered ropes, lanterns, and horses. Search parties formed quickly near the edge of the forest. And as Kofi stared toward the dark trees where his wife had disappeared, he realized something terrifying. He might already be too late. Morning sunlight slowly spread across the mountains, but the forest still looked wounded from the terrible storm. Broken branches covered the ground. Floodwater rushed through deep muddy paths. Uprooted trees lay scattered across the hills like fallen giants. And somewhere inside that dangerous wilderness, the villagers feared Nia was dead. Groups of men moved carefully through the forest carrying ropes, sticks, and lanterns left over from the night before. Kofi walked ahead of them with a pale face and restless eyes. Nia, he shouted again. Only silence answered him. Every passing minute filled his chest with deeper fear. He kept remembering the moment she walked out into the storm. The pain in her eyes. The tears she tried to hide. And worst of all, his silence. A villager suddenly stopped near a muddy trail. Kofi, he called softly. Kofi hurried over. Half buried in the mud was a torn piece of cloth. Nia's cloth. Kofi froze. He recognized the fabric immediately from the dress she had been wearing the night before. Fear tightened around his throat. Then another man pointed toward the ground nearby. There's blood here. Kofi's knees nearly gave out. Small dark stains mixed with rainwater and mud led deeper into the forest. For the first time, the full horror of what Nia had suffered began crashing into him. She had been in pain, alone, pregnant, and he had let her walk away. Kofi closed his eyes as guilt tore through his heart. A painful memory suddenly returned. Months earlier, Nia had stood crying quietly in their home while his mother insulted her again. She is lazy, the old woman had snapped. Weak women bring shame into families. Nia had looked at Kofi with pleading eyes. Please say something. But Kofi had stayed silent then too. Not because he hated her, but because he feared standing against his family. He had spent years trying to keep peace inside the house. Years avoiding conflict. Years pretending silence was harmless. Now he realized that silence had destroyed the woman he loved. Kofi, one of the villagers whispered carefully. Kofi opened his eyes again. Ahead of them, hidden between broken trees, stood the remains of the old hunter's hut. Or what was left of it. Part of the roof had completely collapsed. Wooden walls leaned dangerously sideways. Rainwater flooded the inside. Kofi rushed toward it desperately. Nia. No answer came. Inside the ruined shelter, he found blood-stained cloth scattered across the floor. And then he saw something else. Tiny footprints. Very small. Beside them were marks in the mud where someone had crawled or struggled to stand. Kofi stared silently. His heart stopped. She had the baby here, he whispered. The villagers looked at one another with shock. Kofi covered his face with trembling hands as tears finally broke free. The image crushed him completely. Nia screaming in pain. Alone inside the storm. Giving birth without help while he remained safely at home. I failed her, he whispered brokenly. No one answered. Because deep down, they all knew it was true. Far away from the forest, inside Mama Sade's warm farmhouse, Nia gently rocked her newborn beside the fire. The baby girl slept peacefully in her arms. For the first time in years, Nia's heart felt calm. Not happy. Not healed. But calm. Mama Sade sat nearby quietly sewing torn cloth while sunlight entered softly through the small windows. She looks like you, the old woman said gently. Nia smiled faintly while touching the baby's tiny fingers. She's beautiful, Nia whispered. The newborn opened her eyes briefly before falling asleep again against her chest. Nia felt tears fill her eyes. Nobody had ever needed her this way before. Nobody had ever looked at her with such complete trust. Mama Sade watched her carefully. You are thinking deeply today, she said. Nia stayed quiet for a long moment before speaking softly. I don't know if I want to go back. The old woman did not seem surprised. Nia looked down at the fire. For years, I kept hoping things would change, she admitted. I kept telling myself Kofi would protect me one day. Her voice trembled painfully. But every time I needed him, he disappeared into silence. Mama Sade nodded slowly. Broken trust is not easily repaired. Nia kissed her daughter's forehead gently. Out here, she whispered. For the first time in a long time. I can breathe. Before Mama Sade could answer, barking suddenly echoed outside the farmhouse. The old woman stood slowly and looked through the window. Several villagers were approaching the house. And at the front of them, Kofi. Nia's body stiffened instantly. Fear. Pain. Anger. All the old wounds returned at once. A loud knock came at the door. Mama Sade opened it carefully. Kofi stepped inside slowly, his clothes still covered with mud from the search. Then he saw Nia. Alive. Holding their baby. For a moment, he could not breathe. Tears filled his eyes instantly. Nia, he whispered. Then his gaze dropped to the newborn child sleeping in her arms. Shock spread across his face. Our daughter. His legs suddenly gave out beneath him. Kofi fell to his knees on the wooden floor, crying openly. I'm sorry, he whispered brokenly. I'm so sorry. Nia stared at him silently. Part of her wanted to cry. Part of her wanted to scream. But mostly, she felt tired. Very tired. Kofi looked at her desperately. Please forgive me. Nia's arms tightened protectively around the baby. Her voice remained calm, but distant. You left me alone long before the storm came. The words hit Kofi harder than any punishment. Tears rolled down his face as silence filled the room. And for the first time in his life, Kofi truly understood the damage his weakness had caused. Several days passed quietly at Mama Sade's farmhouse. The storm was gone now. Sunlight warmed the hills again, and the forest slowly came back to life. Birds returned to the trees. The floodwaters lowered little by little. But inside Nia's heart, the storm was still fading slowly. Each morning, she sat near the window holding her baby girl close while soft wind moved through the curtains. The child had become her whole world. Sometimes Nia would simply stare at her daughter in silence, amazed they had both survived that terrible night. Mama Sade helped care for them like family. She prepared warm meals, boiled herbs for Nia's recovery, and sang soft songs while rocking the baby beside the fire. And every single day, Kofi returned. At first, Nia refused to speak much to him. He would stand quietly outside the farmhouse carrying food, fresh water, blankets, or medicine. Sometimes he repaired broken fences around Mama Sade's home without being asked. Other times, he simply sat outside beneath the tree for hours, waiting patiently. Not demanding forgiveness. Not making excuses. Just waiting. One afternoon, Nia watched through the window as Kofi chopped firewood silently under the hot sun. Mama Sade glanced toward him. "He keeps coming back," the old woman said softly. Nia lowered her eyes. "He should have protected me before." Mama Sade nodded slowly. "Yes," she replied. "He should have." The old woman placed another piece of wood into the fire before speaking again. But sometimes people do not understand the damage they cause until they nearly lose everything. Nia remained silent. Deep inside her heart, anger still lived there. But so did something else. Painful hope. Meanwhile, back in the village, whispers about the storm night spread quickly. People learned how Nia had given birth alone in the forest. How she nearly died. How nobody from her husband's family had gone after her. The villagers began looking at Kofi's family differently. One afternoon, Kofi stood outside his family home while several villagers nearby listened carefully. His mother crossed her arms angrily. "So now you blame your own family," she snapped. Kofi looked at her with tired eyes. "No," he answered quietly. "I blame myself." The old woman looked shocked. Kofi took a deep breath. "For years, I stayed silent while Nia suffered in this house. I told myself I was keeping peace." His voice trembled slightly, but silence became cruelty. The villagers exchanged surprised looks. Never before had Kofi spoken against his family publicly. His mother's face hardened. "That woman turned you against us." "No," Kofi replied firmly. "My weakness did." The word spread through the village quickly. For the first time, people saw genuine shame in him. And for the first time, Kofi himself finally understood what kind of husband he had become. Back at the farmhouse, Nia slowly regained her strength. One evening, while the baby slept peacefully beside them, Mama Sade sat beside Nia outside under the setting sun. The mountains glowed orange and gold in the fading light. "You are thinking about your future," Mama Sade said gently. Nia nodded. "I don't know what to do." The old woman smiled softly. "Forgiveness is not weakness, child." Nia looked at her carefully. But forgiveness without change is only another path back to suffering. The words settled deeply into Nia's heart. Mama Sade continued softly. "True love is not words spoken during happy times. True love protects. It sacrifices. It changes when it has caused pain." Nia stared quietly toward the hills. Part of her still loved Kofi. That truth hurt the most. But another part of her feared returning to the same life. The same silence. The same loneliness. That night, Kofi arrived again carrying fresh milk and medicine for the baby. Before leaving, he stopped near the doorway. "Nia," he said quietly. She looked at him cautiously. For a long moment, he struggled to speak. Then finally, the truth came out. "When you left that night," his voice broke slightly, "I was more afraid of disappointing my family than losing you." Nia's eyes filled slowly with tears. Kofi lowered his head in shame. "I failed you long before the storm," he admitted. "And I have no excuse for it." The room became completely silent. Even Mama Sade watched quietly from the corner. Kofi looked at his sleeping daughter. "I cannot change the pain I caused," he whispered. "But I want to spend the rest of my life becoming worthy of both of you." For the first time, Nia saw no pride left in him. Only honesty. Only regret. And maybe change. Days later, Nia finally made her decision. She stood outside the farmhouse holding her daughter while warm wind moved through the grass. Kofi waited nearby silently. Nia looked directly at him. "If I return," she said carefully, "things will not be the same." Kofi nodded immediately. "You will respect me," she continued. "You will protect our daughter. And I will never again live as someone without a voice in my own home." Her words were calm but strong. Kofi's eyes filled with emotion. "I promise." Nia studied his face carefully. This time, she was not looking for perfect words. She was looking for truth. Finally, after a long silence, she gave a small nod. Not complete forgiveness. Not yet. But a beginning. Months later, the rainy season finally ended. Green fields stretched across the village under bright sunlight. Children laughed near the riverbanks while women gathered water beneath clear blue skies. And through the center of Kitala walked Nia. Strong. Confident. alive. She carried her baby girl proudly in her arms while villagers smiled warmly at them. The child born during the storm had become a symbol throughout the village. A child of survival. A child of hope. Beside Nia walked Kofi. Not ahead of her. Beside her. And as warm sunlight covered the village once more, Nia looked down at her daughter and smiled softly. Because after the darkest storm of her life, a new beginning had finally arrived.